Okay, so this is, for me anyway, I don't know if this is true for you, but for me, this series has been much anticipated. I'm super excited about it. I've been thinking about it for a while. In fact, I think it was a little over a year ago that Reagan Troshin, we were having a conversation, and we were talking about what it was I was going to preach next. And she said, I really think you need to preach a series on the Ten Commandments like you did when we first opened this place a few years ago. And I said, why? And she said, because that series was so foundational, not only for me, but for our church. And so I kind of postponed it and preached other things last year. And then early part of this summer, I was like, what am I going to preach in the fall? And that's when I decided I'm going to go back through the Ten Commandments. I've preached through the Ten Commandments 2 other times in my life. Once probably in like 2011, 2012. That one was called, I think that series was called How to Be Perfect. And then about 3 years ago, a little over 3 years ago, 3.5 years ago, I preached a series on the Ten Commandments that I entitled Unmasked. And I was going back through those sermons yesterday and the day before and saw a lot of material that I loved and material that I will use again. But I've grown in the last 3.5 years. Life has happened, and I've learned a lot more about myself and about life and about God and all that stuff. And so I'm coming to this series with some fresh eyes and some real fresh excitement. So I've entitled this series Breaking the Law. And for all of you who commented on any of my social media posts that you wanted me to play Judas Priest's Breaking the Law song that was made famous on Beavis and Butthead many years ago, I was very tempted to do it. Okay, I've always been a huge Judas Priest fan, but I decided, nah, that may be a little weird. So we are going to go through each of the 10 Commandments over the next 10, 11 weeks or so. So for the next 2 months, we'll be making our way through the 10 Commandments. My hope and prayer is that you will hear them like you've never heard them before. The 10 Commandments are often misunderstood in terms of what they are intended to do to us. And so I'm hoping, believe it or not, that by taking a deep dive into each commandment that we would not only get to know ourselves better, but get to know God better. And as a result, we would be more free, that we would live more free. So I want to start this series not by reading the 10 Commandments, but by actually going to 2 New Testament verses, Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. And it'll make sense to you in a few minutes why I'm starting a series on the 10 Commandments in the book of Matthew. But Matthew chapter 5, beginning in verse 1, and just reading 1 and 2. One day, as he, Jesus, saw the crowds gathering, he went up on the mountainside and sat down. His disciples gathered around him, and he began to teach them. So as I said, I've been looking forward to this series now for weeks. And this may sound like an overstatement, but I think that much of our confusion about who God is, who we are, and what we and everybody else in this world are capable of is based on how we understand or misunderstand the 10 Commandments. We treat them as if they're doable. That's typically the way we look at the 10 Commandments, that these are things we must do to ensure God's blessings, things we must do to ensure God's love and God's approval. We look at ourselves and others as if we all have what it takes to keep the 10 Commandments. In fact, the fascination of many religious people to put the 10 Commandments up in schools confirms this, believe it or not. Every time I hear a religious group talk about the need or push for the 10 Commandments to be put up in schools, I think to myself, you are so confused regarding what the Ten Commandments are intended to do. If we can just familiarize students with the Ten Commandments, this world would be a better place. And yet, that proves that we really have no idea what the Ten Commandments are all about or what they're intended to do. They're not designed to make us better. In fact, they're designed to show us how deep and wide our sin runs. That's what they're intended to do. C.S. Lewis once said that no person knows how bad they are until they have tried very hard to be good. He's on to something. I believe that. You see, the primary purpose of the Ten Commandments is to expose us, to knock us down, to level us, to cut us off at the knees. That's what they are intended to do. God intended the Ten Commandments to be the great revealer of our shadow side. They are designed to unmask us, reveal who we truly are, and confront all manner of self-righteousness in all of us. That's what they're intended to do. They are like the Luxor lamp 3 inches from our face, exposing blemishes we don't think we have. You know, the Luxor lamp in Las Vegas that you can see for like 200 miles away? It's like our face being 3 inches from that thing and seeing blemishes that we've never seen, seeing things about our complexion that we didn't think we had. In other words, the Ten Commandments are not a ladder that we climb, but a wall that we crash into so that we finally cry out, I'm the problem. I'm guilty. I can't do it. I'm undone. And we all need this because we are all remarkably adept at believing the best about ourselves. We rewrite our own stories in our heads so that we're not as bad and guilty as we are. I've done this. I still do this. When Stacy and I met, I was married. I was newly separated from my first wife, my children's mother. We had both done things to hurt one another and evaporate trust in one another. And so we weren't living in the same place. We were living in different places. But I was married. And during that time, in the immediate aftermath, I met Stacy, and we developed a friendship at first, and then it became more romantic. But I was still married. And even though we were separated, my first wife and I, and headed for inevitable divorce, I was still married. And for the first, year, 2 years or so that Stacy and I were together, the narrative that I told myself was that this didn't start out bad. This was okay. I mean, after all, I was separated. What is marriage anyway if it's not just something on paper, blah, blah, okay? And I was sort of rewriting the narrative in my own head so that I could sort of downplay how Stacy and I met and the fact that we should not have pursued each other during a time when I was married, period. No matter how much I want to spin it in my own head, it was an affair. And I didn't want to believe that. I was guilty of that before, and I didn't want to believe that. I wanted this to be pure and all of those things, and yet that's not the way it started. And yet that's what I tried to convince myself of. That's just one example in my life, and I'm sure you could share a lot in your life, of how we rewrite the narratives in our own mind to sort of downplay what we've done or how guilty we are. We don't call a thing what it is. Just call it what it is. Acknowledge it for what it is. It comes much more naturally to think more highly of ourselves than what is actually true. We're all guilty of that. Facing the hard truth about ourselves is so scary that we develop ways to rationalize and rewrite narratives so that we don't have to face who we really are and what we've really done. This comes very natural to us. We develop an overinflated view of ourselves as a defense mechanism because we fear the truth. What Brennan Manning called the imposter syndrome. It is, as you know, much easier to identify the flaws of others, the shortcomings of others, the sins of others, the sketchiness and pride and selfishness of others than it is our own. As I've said before, we are amazing defense attorneys when it comes to our own flaws and amazing judges when it comes to the flaws of others. My friend Nadia says that our drug of choice these days is knowing who we're better than. But the Ten Commandments won't let us get away with any of this nonsense. None of it. The Ten Commandments call a thing what it is, calls us out for who we are. They force us to face the truth about ourselves, the real truth, not the half-truths or the glass is half full truths that we like to believe about ourselves, but the real truth. In fact, they uncomfortably diagnose all of us to be idolaters, murderers, adulterers, thieves, disrespecters of others, time wasters, liars, people who are jealous, insecure, vengeful, selfish, untrusting, judgmental, self-righteous. All of us, not some of us, all of us. In fact, the Apostle Paul says in Romans that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. That none of us are righteous, no, not one, he says in Romans chapter 3. And while we may agree with that theoretically, we don't really believe that. We don't really believe that about ourselves. Because if we did, we'd never get defensive. We'd never shift blame. We'd be quick to admit that we're wrong. We'd be much better listeners. We'd always be empathetic. We'd be quick to give grace. And we get far less frustrated when others don't meet our expectations. So while we may agree with the fact that we are all of the things the Ten Commandments exposes us to be, we don't really believe it. The fact that sin and scandal still shock us proves that we really don't believe we're as bad and guilty and desperate as the Ten Commandments reveal us to be. In fact, the Ten Commandments are a great, great assault on self-righteousness and judgmentalism. None of us like to be around people who are self-righteous. We don't like to be around people who are overly judgmental or around people who have this posture of moral superiority. And yet, at the same time, while we don't like being around people like that, we don't like being told that we are the problem. But the only way for self-righteousness and judgmentalism and that sort of stuff to be kept at bay is if we first admit we are the problem. My greatest problem, the Bible makes this very clear, my greatest problem is not out there. It's not you, it's not other people, it's not circumstances, it's me. I am my worst enemy. And the Ten Commandments expose that about us. And as a result of exposing that, uncomfortable as that is, it also sort of kills self-righteousness. Because if you really believe the diagnosis that the Ten Commandments deliver to us, then we stop thinking we're better than other people. We stop being as judgmental. We start listening more and we start becoming more empathetic. And when someone shares their sins and their struggles and their secrets with us, we simply go, instead of looking at them, looking down our nose at them and thinking that we're better than they are, we look at them and say, me too. I'm guilty too. Maybe not of the same specific circumstances, but I'm no better than you are. The fact that it's so difficult to admit when we're wrong and when we've hurt someone proves that we really don't believe we are as blind as we are. This is true for all of us. So the Ten Commandments really are a gift because they tell us the truth about ourselves. They tell us who we are. And if there is one clear mark of being and living truly free, it is self-awareness. Knowing ourselves truthfully and admitting that truth about ourselves. Now, I know that's scary. Okay, even standing up here and telling you what I did about how Stacy and I met and what it actually was. That's scary. I don't like talking about that stuff. I don't like admitting things about me that are gross, okay? Things about me that are wrong or broken or sinful. I don't like that. It's uncomfortable to do that. And so I know it's scary, but until you can do that, you'll never be free, ever. So, the goal of this series is to make you more self-aware so that you can live more free. That's really the goal. To help you discover the deepest and darkest parts of yourself so that you can see the widest and brightest parts of God's grace. That's what this is all about. Each week, as I mentioned, we're going to look at one of the commandments, but to introduce this series, I read Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, because the Sermon on the Mount, which is Jesus' most famous sermon that you find in Matthew 5, 6, and 7, the Sermon on the Mount is Jesus' sermon on the Ten Commandments. That's what he's preaching. He makes his way through the Ten Commandments. So our conclusions regarding what the Ten Commandments are and how to interpret them must be consistent with how Jesus understands and interprets them. And if we want to know how Jesus understands and interprets them, we have to go to Matthew chapter 5. Jesus preached the Sermon on the Mount primarily to his disciples, but said the things that he said because he was within earshot of the religious leaders who were very skeptical about this guy. So he preached the Sermon on the Mount to those who thought they were keeping the Ten Commandments. And his goal is to show that God's requirements are far more demanding than we realize. He shows that God's demands extend beyond outer behavior to what's inside our hearts. You may say, well, that's a relief, you know? I mean, God sees my heart. I mean, that's a huge relief, regardless of how much I may screw up. At least he sees my intentions. 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 7 says, "For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart." And I remember a time when this verse was a great comfort to me. Because I thought, thank God that he sees my heart. That he doesn't evaluate me the way others do. Others reject me based solely on what they see, but God sees my heart. He sees the real me. He sees behind the curtain of my rough exterior to the softness of my well-intentioned heart. Okay, that's how I used to understand that verse. But then I realized this awful truth, that I have hate in my heart. I have envy in my heart. I have lust and pride and greed and selfishness in my heart. The prophet Jeremiah says that our hearts are deceitful above all things and desperately sick. So then I realized that I'd be a lot better off if God saw me as humans see me. Far from taking comfort in the idea that God saw the inner beauty that no one else could see, I realized that God saw the inner ugliness that I was able to hide from almost everybody else. See, like most of you, or the rest of you, or all of you, I'm good at tricking people. I'm good at covering over the worst parts of myself and concealing my inner darkness from human eyes. Unfortunately for us, God sees all that stuff that we hide from others. So in the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus is pressing through the exterior of behavior into the deepest recesses of our hearts, what he's showing to all of the people who think that they're pretty good and that they're keeping the Ten Commandments is that no one is better than anybody else. I've quoted my friend David Zoll, who once said that we all agree that we have fallen short of God's glory, but that doesn't prevent us from comparing distances. We tend to do that all the time. I know I'm not perfect, but I mean, come on, compared to this guy? Compared to her? Compared to what she did? Compared to what he did? This self-righteousness comes natural to us. Well, this is what God's law does. It exposes the darkness of our heart, not just the imperfection of our behavior. In most religious circles, Christian circles these days, the focus is on good behavior. How do we get bad people to act better? What can we do to ensure that people's behavior changes? And what's so ironic about that is that God wasn't primarily concerned with good behavior at all. If he were, then Jesus would have showcased the Pharisees and told all of us to imitate them. Because when it came to religious behavior modification, no one was better at that stuff than the Pharisees. No one was better at that stuff than the religious people. But Jesus didn't tell us to imitate them. He called them whitewashed tombs. Clean on the outside, but dead on the inside. He called them a brood of vipers. So he didn't tell us to look at them and model our lives after them, the religious people who crossed all their T's and dotted all their I's and often thought of themselves as better than the average person because they were more serious about God. Jesus called those people out more than he called out the tax collectors and prostitutes. He befriended those people. Those people loved him. It was the religious community that couldn't stand him. And they couldn't stand him because he was calling them out as being no better than anybody else. They found a tremendous, as we do, sadly, but the religious community, the religious people in Jesus' day found a tremendous amount of worth and value in believing themselves to be better than everybody else. They were the ones who had gone to seminary. They were the Bible teachers. They were the churchgoers. They were the tithers. They did everything they were supposed to do. And yet Jesus called them out as the worst of the bunch. You guys are the problem, he said. Your understanding of God and yourselves, it was their misunderstanding of God's law and what it was intended to do that created the self-righteousness that was so plaguing to other people. So, for example, throughout this entire sermon, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, Jesus shows that God's demands extend to what goes on inside of us, our feelings and our motivations, not just our external actions, must be absolutely pure and perfect. So, for example, he not only condemns adultery, but lust. He not only condemns murder, but anger, promising the same judgment for both. That while the horizontal consequences of lust and adultery may be different, before God, both are guilty. The horizontal consequences of anger and murder may be vastly different, but before God, they're both guilty. God's law doesn't suggest that we simply try hard to get it right on the outside. It demands that we be perfect on the outside and the inside. No wiggle room at all, none. You must always love perfectly, sacrificially, selflessly, sinlessly, not just on the outside, but on the inside too. In other words, you must always want to love perfectly, sacrificially, and selflessly. I don't know where we got this idea that if we do what's right on the outside, even though we don't want to do it on the inside, that somehow it's honorable. Now, I'm not saying only do what you feel like doing. I mean, if there's something right that you ought to do and you don't feel like doing it, do it anyway. But don't confuse that with being righteous. Because in fact, when we do something that we ought to do, but inside we don't really want to do it, that exposes our unrighteousness. The fact that even though we're doing it, we don't want to do it. Our heart's not in it. It's what Jesus said about the Pharisees also. With your lips you worship me, but your hearts are far from me. It's always the heart that God is after. You must never, the law makes this clear, you must never, ever hurt anyone. Ever. Physically, emotionally, relationally, and you must always help everyone all the time. Physically, emotionally, and relationally. You must never harbor grudges. Never. You must never seek retribution. Ever. In fact, you must never even want to seek retribution. You must never, ever withhold forgiveness from anyone who wrongs you. Ever. In fact, you must never even want to withhold forgiveness from anyone who wrongs you. Ever. When someone cheats you, instead of trying to get your stuff or your money back, you must give them more. You must turn the other cheek to your most aggressive enemies. And you must do these things because you want to do them, not because you have to do them. In other words, your love for others must be perfectly selfless. Or in the words of Jesus, you must be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. Those are the requirements. Those are the demands. That's what God requires from us. And none of us can do it. None of us have done it. None of us are doing it. None of us will do it. We're not even capable of doing this stuff. Not even capable. I remember the first time I preached through the Ten Commandments, I was probably in like week 4 or 5, and I was interpreting the Ten Commandments and teaching the Ten Commandments the way I'm teaching them now and the way I will teach them throughout this series. And about week 4 or 5, I started getting letters from people, okay? Not so much people inside the church, but people who would watch online and see the sermons or hear the podcast or whatever. And I started getting letters from people saying things like this. I understand your point that the Ten Commandments are not something we can keep before we become Christians. But once we become Christians and we have the Holy Spirit inside of us, don't we become increasingly able to keep the Ten Commandments? And my response was, that's an interesting question. It's interesting theologically. It's interesting theoretically, but that's not the question that is primary. The primary question is not, can we keep them? The primary question is, are you keeping them? And if the answer is no, then just shut up and thank God for Jesus. Because we get so wrapped up, caught up in, well, but can't we? All of that's theoretical, it's theological, it makes for a good article in a theological journal, but I'm interested in life. I'm interested in what life really is. And the fact of the matter is, whether we can keep them or not, we don't. And if we can keep them and we don't, that makes things even worse. So don't be so quick to go, yeah, but we can keep them, because if we can and you're not, that compounds the guilt. So it's really irrelevant to me whether or not we can. What's relevant to me and what was primarily relevant to Jesus was, are you doing these things? Are you feeling these things? Are you loving and serving and giving sacrificially, sinlessly, selflessly? Are you doing these things, not just on the outside, but is there a deep desire to do these things on the inside? Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10:31, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. Eating, drinking, do it all for the glory of God. Who does that? I mean, seriously, if you can sit there and go, well, that's a description of the way I am, you're delusional, okay? I mean, whether you eat, he leaves no wiggle room there, Paul does. Whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, yes, that is what we should do. We should do everything for God's glory. Everything, and we don't. We do stuff for our glory. We do stuff to further our agenda. We manipulate stories and narratives to serve ourselves. And once in a blue moon, we may have a fleeting moment where we are so enraptured by God's love for us that we do something purely out of love for God. But that's very few and far between, and even the purity by which we think we're doing something for God isn't all that pure anyway. Okay, none of our motives are ever pure. I've told you this story about the couple that came to see me one time about, 10, 11 years ago, and they were making a decision or needing to make a decision about what to do next. The husband had been offered a job in a different state, and they really loved our church, and their family was thriving there at the church and the school, but they were wrestling with whether or not the husband should take this job. And so they came to seek some counsel and advice from me, and they began by saying, we just want to make sure that whatever decision we make, our motives are pure. And I said, well, time out. I said, let me set you at ease before we even get started. Your motives regarding any decision you ever make will never be pure, ever. There's always some imperfection and sin and selfishness sort of mixed in with all of that stuff. Okay, that's just what it means to be a broken, fallen, flawed person. We're never going to have pure motives. We're never going to glorify God fully in everything we do and feel and think, ever. Love the Lord your God with all of your heart and all of your mind and all of your soul and all of your strength. That's the demand. We can't do it. And I shared weeks ago the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, this German philosopher who was sort of a weird guy, but brilliant. And he developed what was called Kantian ethics. And essentially, Kantian ethics was the demand to do something implies the ability to do it. And without even realizing it, most people don't even know the name of Immanuel Kant, but that idea sort of filtered down and made it into pop culture and made it into the church, so much so that when we read the Bible and we read commands and demands in the Bible, we assume, thanks to Immanuel Kant, we assume that the demand that we're reading implies the ability to do it, when it's the exact opposite. The demand that we are reading exposes the fact that we aren't doing it, and we need outside help. We need someone to come and rescue us from the fact that we can't do it. We need someone to do it for us. And of course, that's the gospel. You see, it's only when we see that God's law is inflexible that we will see that God's grace is indispensable. Until you take God's law at face value and see it for what it is, and go ahead and just bow the knee to God's diagnosis of you, grace will not amaze you. Grace, the way we view ourselves is very connected to the way we view God's grace. So if we think of ourselves as better than we ought, it's kind of like a pair of old-fashioned scales. Our view of God's grace goes down. And as our view of ourselves goes down, our view of God's grace goes up. And then we never ask questions like, okay, we've heard about grace. When can we move on to something else? And I'm like, you don't know yourself very well if you think you're able to move on to something else, or you've graduated beyond the need to hear about God's grace. See, the Ten Commandments tell us things about ourselves that make us uncomfortable. But when it comes to finding freedom, telling the truth is where it all begins, or at least it should. And in learning about ourselves, we learn much about God. John Calvin, the 16th century reformer, wrote in the beginning of the introduction to his thick theological textbook called the Institutes. He says this in the first paragraph: without knowledge of self, there is no knowledge of God. And without knowledge of God, there is no true knowledge of self. The two go hand in hand. So we have to, if we ever hope to understand God for who He truly is, we have to first understand uncomfortably the truth of who we really are. The good news of all this comes in Matthew chapter 5, verse 17, where after Jesus levels the playing field, he simply says, I didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. The demands that God has for us, God's requirements, God's standards, are things we can't do. We can't accomplish that stuff. We can't be good enough to get God to like us. We can't be good enough to get God to approve of us. We can't transform ourselves enough to get God to love us. The law, in all of its meticulous detail, had to be fulfilled. And so Jesus, the rap on Jesus, of course, was that he swept sin under the rug, and he was friends with all of these bad, sort of nasty, sinful people. And he was just like, oh, don't worry, grace, don't worry about it, dude, don't worry about it. That was the rap on him. But that's not what he says. He says, you guys have it all wrong. I didn't come to abolish the law. I came to fulfill it. I came to dot every I. I came to cross every T. I came to do all of the right things, the perfect things, the good things, because you couldn't do it. I haven't come to abolish the law. I've come to fulfill it. I have come to meet the demands for you. In other words, the lawmaker became the law keeper and died for us, the lawbreakers. That's the gospel. Substitution is the name of the game in Christianity. You could say it like this, and I've said it like this many times, that Jesus fulfilled all of God's perfect conditions so that our relationship to God could be perfectly unconditional. That's the gospel. That is grace upon grace. That the lawmaker became the law keeper and died for us, the lawbreakers. I've come not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. Which is why we looked a few weeks ago in Hebrews where, this is before I left for summer break, but in Hebrews where it says, without faith it is impossible to please God. And we read that and go, okay, in order for God to be pleased with us, I need to be faithful. But that's not what it says. What it says is, without faith, without banking everything on the one who alone pleased God for you, there's no other way. No other way. It is what Jesus has done for us that gets us in with God, that makes us right with God, that bridges the gap between us and God. As I said, Jesus fulfilled all of God's perfect conditions so that our relationship to God could be perfectly unconditional, which is why the psalmist says, He casts your sin as far as the east is from the west and remembers your sin no more. Remembers it no more. The sins we can't forget, God doesn't remember. Well, how is that true? The Ten Commandments expose me for being this, broken, perverse, sinful, struggling, secret-keeping person. Yeah, but that's been taken care of. As far as God is concerned, that's been taken care of. As far as your relationship to God is concerned, it is finished. Don't worry about that. Now, be mindful of the way you live because it affects you and everyone around you, but it doesn't affect God and how God feels about you, God's disposition towards you. I watched yesterday morning, a friend of mine pointed this out to me, an interview that I found mind-blowingly fascinating. Stephen Colbert interviewed Nick Cave. Nick Cave is an Australian singer. He headed the band Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds. He's most known for his song Red Right Hand, which I first heard when I saw Dumb and Dumber the first time in the movie theater. Had no idea that it was Nick Cave who sang it, but that's his most famous song. He's an incredibly thoughtful, he's in his mid-60s now, he's incredibly thoughtful. He's a writer, he's an actor, he continues to be a musician. And he was a real rabble-rouser in his younger years. He was known as sort of the architect of gothic rock, shock rock, back in the 70s. And he's experienced a tremendous amount of suffering over the course of his life. 2 of his sons died. And that really shook him up in a way that caused him to start exploring who God is. And this interview with Stephen Colbert was unbelievable. I mean, excellent, absolutely excellent. I'll put it up on my social media so you can find it, a link to it. But in the interview, Stephen Colbert, and I just want to read one small section of their interview because it illustrates everything I've said so far really, really well. Stephen Colbert quotes a Leonard Cohen song called Suzanne in the interview. And these are the words of that song. Jesus was a sailor who walked upon the water, and he spent a long time watching from his lonely wooden tower until he knew for certain only drowning men could see him. And he said, all men will be sailors until the sea shall free them. It is the drowning that frees us. And he wanted Nick Cave's response to that. And Nick Cave, after saying, yeah, I'm a huge Leonard Cohen fan, he said this: it is the devastation that I think we all experience that turns us from being a kind of half-formed person into a fully formed person. I don't mean to be a sort of prophet of doom, but devastation is coming for everybody at some point. This is part of the deal, I think, and it's coming for you if you're lucky. Brilliant insight. Brilliant. That's what the law does. That's what the Ten Commandments do. They usher in devastation at the point of our self-assuredness. Not to bind us up, but to finally set us free. There is no deep freedom apart from admission of guilt. None. If it's always somebody else's problem, if it's always his fault, her fault, if it's always this world's fault, it's the government's fault, if it's always someone else's fault, and you're rarely guilty, if ever, you will never be a free person. In fact, the person that's always shifting blame and pointing the finger and complaining about other people and all of that stuff, those are the people that by doing so exhibit the fact that they are still deeply enslaved. When you're free, you can say things like, me too. Yeah, I get it. I'm able to call a thing what it is, even if it exposes me. The law tells us that we have failed at every point. The gospel tells us that Jesus succeeded for us at every point of our failure. I want to conclude by reading something that I wrote years ago. I wrote this in 2014, and I was playing around with it this morning. editing it, and I want to end with this. Normally, the outdoorsy image of choice for spiritual growth is mountain climbing. You know how it is. New Christian at the bottom of the mountain, mature Christian near the top. But I want to take you a different way. So let's go spelunking. Spelunking is cave exploration. And it's my suggestion for the most honest way to think about spiritual growth. Instead of thinking of spiritual growth as a climb up a mountain, let's think of it as a trip down into a cave. Whereas a mountain climbing expedition gets higher and higher, and we might be tempted to think better and better, a caving exploration goes deeper and deeper, exploring the undiscovered depths. Spiritual growth is not about climbing a mountain, getting better, and therefore needing God and His grace less and less. Spiritual growth is about discovering more and bigger caverns of need into which more and more of God's grace can flow. We think spiritual growth is about the heights we should attain, when in reality, it is about acknowledging the breadth of our need. Or, to put it another way, spiritual growth is marked by a growing realization of just how much grace we need. True growth involves recognizing that there is always another cavern to explore. There's always another crevice of self-centeredness or stalactite of jealousy. The light of God's grace shines into deeper and darker corners and proclaims, yes, I can free you here too. Spiritual growth is not, I'm becoming stronger and more competent every day. Rather, it is, I'm becoming increasingly aware of how weak and incompetent I am and how strong and competent Jesus is and was and continues to be for me. There is no pit so deep that God's love is not deeper still. So how does real growth and freedom happen? It happens by admitting the truth about ourselves to ourselves, allowing the 10 Commandments to do their exposing work. And as uncomfortable as it may be to see these parts of us that we would rather keep concealed, exposed, at least to us, we will become more free, more liberated, more willing to tell the truth about ourselves, because in knowing more about ourselves, we know more about God. And in knowing more about God, we know more about ourselves. Let's pray together. God, thank you for your mercies, which are new every morning. Every single one of us would be screwed without them. In Jesus' name, amen.